most important and happiest moments of my life was when I was awarded the certificate and rank of Senior Full Instructor in Jeet Kune Do and Filipino martial arts by my instructor, Armando Basulto. Really has been a great privilege and honor because after receiving that certification, I was able to share my passion for Jeet Kune Do and Filipino martial arts with an added level of credibility, expertise, authority, and responsibility. But it didn't make the task of explaining what Jeet Kune Do is any easier. Every time I get the question, what martial art is it that you teach? And I say Jeet Kune Do. And then when they ask me, oh, could you tell me a little bit more about that? Strangely, it's not as simple an idea or a martial art to explain to anybody. Nowadays, it's relatively easy to explain what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is, what Muay Thai is, what boxing is, even what karate or judo is. There's a general idea of what it is. However, despite the fact that Jeet Kune Do has been around for over 50 years, and even though it has been attached to the greatest name in martial arts cinema, the legendary Bruce Lee, there's still a lot of confusion around the art that Bruce Lee founded, the art of Jeet Kune Do. What I hope to do with this episode is to explain what Jeet Kune Do is to the best of my ability, but most of all, to make the connection between Jeet Kune Do and edge weapons training. There are several factors that contribute to the confusion of communicating what Jeet Kune Do is, and a big part of that is its inherent connection to the founder itself, the legendary Bruce Lee. Many people have a very difficult time separating the art of Jeet Kune Do from the very presence of Bruce Lee in cinema, and that is very understandable. His presence is so electrifying on film, and his martial movements are so efficient and effective and clearly very memorable and impactful that once you hear that he was the founder of his own martial art, Jeet Kune Do, you can easily make the assumption and the correlation that what he did on film is exactly what he was doing in real life and what he was teaching his students and writing about in his books. But nothing could be further from the truth. There is no nunchaku curriculum in his notes. There is no how-to in flying sidekick techniques. In fact, I would dare say 95% of what he displayed on film cannot be found in any of his notes as it relates to Jeet Kune Do, and none of his students will also claim that the stuff that you saw on film was exactly what he taught them. So in order for us to reach a level of clarity about the art and philosophy and fighting method that he created, it's important for us to separate the legend of Bruce Lee, especially the one that we became familiar with in his cinematic appearances, from the art that he created. That way we can have a conversation that will add more clarity to the art that he created and the art that I happen to be certified in. At the time of Jeet Kune Do's inception, the martial arts scene, especially in the United States, could not be more different from what we know today. Today's martial arts scene, especially from what we see in the Bourne Identity movies, the John Wick movies, and also what we see in the UFC, and frankly, even what we see in Disney movies, there is a much more realistic, common sense view of how martial arts actually operates. But at the time of Bruce Lee, when he was just starting to come up as a martial artist and starting to ideate the main principles of his art of Jeet Kune Do, that era was far more known for brick-breaking demonstrations, ice-breaking demonstrations, flying sidekick demonstrations, and point sparring where martial artists wearing uniforms would proceed to fight in quote-unquote full contact matches without gloves but would barely touch each other, and the winner was determined by points. We can imagine the obstacles that Bruce Lee was running into when he was trying to create the art of Jeet Kune Do. Not only were the martial arts really far more separated from realistic combat, he was trying to overcome the traditions that came from those martial arts, a lot of which had nothing to do with the learning and development of the student, but it also had nothing to do with the kind of learning styles that college-educated students at the time were starting to bring to the table. Prior to this, a lot of the classical structures of martial arts prior to the 20th century were relegated to a teaching methodology that relied upon the top-down methodology, wherein the transmission of knowledge assumed that the student at the very bottom had a knowledge deficiency, and the assumption is that the sensei or sifu acted as both father figure and teacher, and this individual had all the knowledge relative to that system. A lot of those systems assumed that not only did the student lack talent or the desire to learn, the other assumption is that the instructor at the very top was flawless. So you can imagine what that dyad was. This individual had all the knowledge, therefore they had the right to test this person and put them through all types of processes like uniforms, belts, katas, or forms so that they could prove that they were worthy of the knowledge. This became very different in the 1950s and 60s, especially in the United States, where a lot of young people wanted to learn more about martial arts, but they tended to be college educated. So the way they learned had less to do with simply receiving it because they were in a form of deficiency. They really wanted to have a conversation about what that type of knowledge they were receiving, but also if there were any inconsistencies in the knowledge that was being transferred by this instructor, they had a right to question it. It was a very interesting generational dynamic who tended to question not only classical martial arts systems, but they tended to question everything in general. So in comes Bruce Lee, who was just starting to put together his ideas around Jeet Kune Do. But as he was developing this, he himself was becoming frustrated in that exact learning structure where he came from, this structure of more top-down, when he wanted something where it was a little more conversational because he was an extremely intelligent and very physically talented athlete who wanted to learn from a lot of sources. Aside from getting his degree in philosophy and amassing a library of 2,000 books, he learned from a lot of individuals, a lot of styles, so you can start to see that Bruce Lee is far closer to how we learn than how previous generations had learned. He learned from many sources, through books, through TV shows, and even in movies. He had more sources of information that he can go through that allowed him to bypass the traditional sifu or sensei. When the idea finally came to him as to what Jeet Kune Do was going to be, he had two big problems. There would be a third and fourth problem later on. His first problem was that when he came to this idea, he was only 24 years old. Even though the idea was perfect, he was still in many ways an evolving martial artist, but most of all, an evolving coach. So the first problem that he had was he had a great idea, but he didn't know how to teach it. The second problem that he had was that during the 1960s, you didn't necessarily have a lot of martial artists like today who are coming in with a substantial background. Nowadays, if you receive a student that comes into your school, a lot of them have not only an athletic background, but have a fitness regimen in place and have an understanding through the UFC and today's mainstream media of how martial arts actually works. People have an understanding of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the ground game and the stand-up game, even an understanding of weaponry. But in the 1950s and 1960s, people were still getting overwhelmed by Elvis, the Beatles, and a very young Cassius Clay who later became Muhammad Ali. So when Bruce Lee was coming at them with ideas around simple and direct economy of motion, the theory of four ranges, and being able to borrow from martial arts from all over the world and making it your own individual expression of martial art, a lot of people just went, no, what? That was his secondary problem. So what ended up happening with his Jeet Kune Do in the early days, his first problem was he was still kind of developing as a sifu and a coach. And what he wanted was a kind of student that he could have those conversations with. It's one of the main reasons why, when he became an instructor, he tended to attract and accept students who already had a martial background. As Guru Danny Nisanto likes to say, Jeet Kune Do is more of the PhD course in your martial development rather than your basics course. So those are the first two problems that he ran into. Then, of course, the third and fourth problem. His untimely death created such a massive earthquake not only in the entertainment industry around the world, but among his students who followed his art, who frankly were not prepared for his untimely death. The fourth factor, which really cannot be helped, is that after his untimely death, his legend grew even bigger. His legend and his fame grew to such mythical proportions that it is far easier now to confuse what he does on film to what his art was about. So in many instances, when they go to a Jeet Kune Do instructor, they ask the Jeet Kune Do instructor about, hey, do you remember that scene in Fist of Fury? Hey, so what about that scene in Chinese Connection where he was able to fight against a samurai sword? Can you teach me that? What about in Enter the Dragon? Able to calm down a cobra? Can you teach me that? So Jeet Kune Do instructors are in this mess that we all inherited simply because of the four factors that I mentioned. Bruce Lee had a great idea that he was not mature yet to fully codify for generations to be able to inherit and then pass on. Number two, a lot of students at that time weren't even ready for the knowledge that he had. Number three, his untimely death. And number four, his legend completely surpassing the work that he created, the simple idea of Jeet Kune Do. But if we move away from all of that and just get to the nitty-gritty of how Jeet Kune Do actually works, what I'm happy to share with you is that what I have found is that the ideas behind Jeet Kune Do are far more familiar to us than we would initially suspect. Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, as it was coined was Bruce Lee, has three main martial arts that contributes to it, also mentioned by Bruce Lee and also confirmed by Guru Dan Inosanto. Those three main martial arts happen to be Wing Chun, the classical Chinese martial art of the legendary Ip Man, who happens to be his teacher, boxing, which he competed in when he was in high school, and Olympic-style sport fencing, which he learned from his older brother, who happened to have been a champion in Olympic-style fencing. There are two key takeaways here. Some of you may have already figured it out, but if we are to go by what Bruce Lee and Dan Inosanto said, Dan Inosanto being his protege and who is responsible for the complete propagation of Jeet Kune Do, which he has called Jeet Kune Do concepts, and we go on the assumption that the martial art of Jeet Kune Do is made up of the main principles, strategies, and biomechanics of classical Wing Chun, boxing, and fencing, we can come to two key conclusions just by taking a look at these three source martial arts. The first conclusion is this: 2/3 of Jeet Kune Do is European martial art. That all three martial arts are blade arts. Let's start with Wing Chun. It's very clear. Wing Chun has double butterfly swords as part of its advanced curriculum. And interestingly enough, those two butterfly swords look a little bit like D-guard Bowie knives. How about that? Boxing, that one's very easy. Boxing's movements and strategies are based off of the classical rapier dagger. But the third one, another Captain Obvious. It's Olympic sports fencing. Jeet Kune Do is Bruce Lee's martial arts of empty-hand combat that is based on the principles, strategies, and biomechanics of classical edged weapons training. Let's take, for example, some of the important techniques that come from Jeet Kune Do, the straight lead. And it goes straight down the center line with the idea of longest weapon, nearest target. That's also from fencing. But the biomechanics is what makes it very interesting for me, because in my studies, the biomechanics of a straight lead is very similar to that of a Bowie snap cut. When I extend my arm, there is a snap at the wrist coming forward, but there's a very subtle one wherein the bottom part of my hand punches up first, then snaps forward second. Classical Jeet Kune Do straight lead, we don't need to snap forward, but the rest of it stays together. It's the same exact biomechanics. As I go down the center line, extend my arm, and then snap my wrist forward, that's my straight lead. Another technique that Bruce Lee borrowed from boxing, but in fact has the same exact biomechanics of a very famous knife technique. This is called the corkscrew punch. Corkscrew punch is a rear tool technique wherein, you ready for this? I throw the punch over, pop the elbow up, and then I drive the punch down. This should look very familiar to you for anyone who's been following my episodes for a very long time, because that technique has the same exact biomechanic if it is switched to the lead hand for a back cut. So a corkscrew punch, and this is a combination that you see a lot in Jeet Kune Do, especially in the Chun fan days, where throw a straight lead and you throw a corkscrew punch. That's fundamentally a snap cut and a back cut. So we start to get a better understanding of the strategy, principles, and biomechanics of Jeet Kune Do through the lens of edged weaponry. So what you're going to see me do for the rest of the episode is share with you some of the standard Jeet Kune Do techniques. You'll start to see that the biomechanics and the principles in place have everything to do in what we have found in edged weaponry. And it is no surprise that we see edged weaponry principles in the three martial arts that Jeet Kune Do is based on: classical Wing Chun, boxing, and European fencing. Thank you for letting me share, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Let's start with the double buoy methodology, and as mentioned before, the double buoy actually resembles the Wing Chun butterfly swords in terms of appearance. The right hand is in the edge down orientation with the left hand in the edge up orientation, and notice that when I am firing that thrust with the right hand, notice that it starts to create the biomechanics for the straight lead, while the left hand creates the mechanics for the low cross. We will be focusing on the axial anatomy, which is the anatomy along the spine, and less attention to the appendicular anatomy, which is going to be along the arms. So what we're trying to do here is to dial in the biomechanics of the movements that we were talking about earlier that come from Jeet Kune Do, which is the straight lead, the corkscrew punch, and also the low cross. Although the double buoy methodology works within its own martial context, as mentioned earlier, Jeet Kune Do lays its biomechanical foundations on blade weaponry methodologies. So what you're seeing here is the use of the buoy knives as training tools to help the Jeet Kune Do practitioner dial in on the motor control patterns so that he can further optimize his empty hand techniques. As mentioned earlier, we will also be using the cold steel holdout XL, which we can use in an earth grip, so that we are going to be adding some of the boxing and panantukan patterns that come from Filipino martial arts. And again, this is another example of how the tool feeds the biomechanics and the overall methodology of empty hands. We're going to be taking a look at this double buoy sequence, specifically isolating the buoy snap cut, which has the same biomechanical sequence as the Jeet Kune Do straight lead. Both of them come from the fencing thrust, with the shoulder protracted on the right side, with the left shoulder retracted on the left side. That left shoulder retraction allows it so that when it uncoils for that corkscrew punch is far more akin to the buoy back cut. So this sequence of the snap cut and back cut, or the straight lead or corkscrew, has the same biomechanical DNA of the double buoy methodology. Going back to the double buoys, now we're going to use simultaneous attacking and defending, this time mimicking some of the movements that we can find in the Wing Chun butterfly swords, where I can rotate along my hips so that I can lead with one buoy and defend with the other. This exact same biomechanical sequence can be found in Jeet Kune Do, where a straight lead is fired and a tan sao can be fired off as a defense. So you can see how the same biomechanical sequence that you saw earlier with the double buoy methodology, which borrows heavily from the Wing Chun butterfly sword methodology, is now seen here. Now we're going to move on to the panantukan methodology using the double ice pick grip using the cold steel holdout. We can generally use this in a tip-up orientation, but it takes away from the boxing biomechanical sequence. So if we turn it into an ice pick grip, we can start to jab and ice pick with the tips and start to create some of the same biomechanical sequencing that we find normally in boxing, with very light jabs and crosses in a particular rhythm. So one of the ways that Jeet Kune Do, especially the way Guru Dan has formulated it, is using the panantukan ice pick grip with double folding knives. We can start to use some of those techniques, like this jab to the groin strike, jab, groin strike, and coming back up to the head. Once we take away the knives, we can start to see how this can work together in a way that is expected in a panantukan methodology, where it's jab, cross, high, low, high, and a series of combinations can then follow. With the blade in the hand, it allows for the same biomechanical sequence for both empty hand and blade sequences to occur. But with the blade in hand, it allows the neural receptors along the wrist and the hand to have a better communication line with the shoulder girdle, which then allows the entire sequence along the myofascial lines to more efficiently deliver the strikes without creating any sort of interference between two techniques. If you happen to have a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu background, think of blade work as gi work and the empty hands work as no gi work. Both optimize the same biomechanical sequence, but blade work provides the variability in neural feedback. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Stick around, stay tuned, more videos to come.